900,000 years ago, the world was locked in an unforgiving ice age. Vast glaciers carved the land, predators stalked the frozen forests, and survival was a daily battle. Among the scattered human tribes, one stood apart: the Neanderthals. Fierce, intelligent, and powerful, they ruled the cold landscapes of Eurasia. Yet even their strength could not protect them forever. A brutal prehistoric war, fought tribe against tribe, would nearly erase them from existence. This is the story of that forgotten conflict, when humanity's survival teetered on the edge of extinction, and the Neanderthals' fate was sealed in blood. If you're listening to this to relax or fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these stories. So feel free to subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing messages like London late at night or Sydney early in the morning. It reminds me that we're all connected, just like the humans who survived these ancient times against all odds. Roughly 400,000 years ago, in the cold, windswept plains of Ice Age Europe, a new kind of human began to emerge. They were not quite like us, and yet not entirely alien either. They were shorter, stockier, with broad chests and powerful limbs. Their skulls were long and low, their brows heavy and pronounced, their faces projecting forward with strong noses, designed to warm the frigid air before it reached their lungs. These were the Neanderthals, a species forged by the ice and snow, adapted not for comfort, but for survival in some of the harshest climates the world has ever known. The Neanderthals did not appear suddenly. They were the product of a long and winding evolutionary path that stretched back millions of years. Their ancestors, archaic humans like Homo heidelbergensis, had already begun to spread into the forests and steppes of Europe. But the continent was an unforgiving place. For hundreds of thousands of years, Europe was shaped by cycles of glaciation, periods when vast sheets of ice advanced from the north, crushing forests, redirecting rivers, and turning fertile lands into frozen deserts. Any creature that survived here had to be resilient, resourceful, and endlessly adaptable. Over countless generations, the Neanderthals became exactly that. Their bodies told the story of their environment. Compared to modern humans, they were shorter in stature, but much stronger, with bones that carried the marks of constant physical strain. This stocky build, combined with their wide rib cages and barrel-like chests, helped them conserve heat in freezing winters. Their hands were broad and powerful, able to grip stone tools with precision and force. Their legs, muscular and sturdy, allowed them to traverse rugged landscapes and chase down large game animals through snow and forest. Where we are built for endurance running across open savannas, they were built for bursts of explosive strength, the kind needed to ambush a massive beast in close quarters. But strength alone does not make a species thrive. The Neanderthals also had brains that rivaled, and in some cases exceeded, the size of modern human brains. Their cranial capacity was slightly larger than ours, though shaped differently. While we cannot say with certainty what this meant for intelligence or creativity, we do know they were skilled toolmakers, master hunters, and capable of symbolic thought. They left behind evidence of burial practices, pigments used to color their bodies or objects, and jewelry crafted from animal bones and teeth. These were not mindless brutes. They were complex beings with culture, identity, and emotion. Archaeological sites across Europe and Western Asia paint a vivid picture of their rise. In caves from Spain to Siberia, scientists have uncovered the remnants of Neanderthal life: hearths blackened with charcoal, stone tools shaped with remarkable precision, bones of animals they hunted and consumed. Some sites reveal evidence of large-scale hunts where entire groups worked together to drive mammoths or woolly rhinoceroses into natural traps, coordinating their efforts with the kind of social cooperation that defines humanity itself. Their stone tools, known as the Mousterian tradition, were not crude improvisations, but carefully designed implements for cutting, scraping, piercing, and hunting. Each flake struck from a core of flint, was part of a deliberate plan, a skill passed down across generations. As the Neanderthals spread across Europe, they encountered a landscape unlike anything we know today. Herds of enormous animals roamed the icy plains. Giant deer with antlers wider than a man is tall, woolly mammoths towering above the snow, cave bears lurking in dark shelters, and saber-toothed cats prowling the forests. To survive here was to live constantly on the edge. A successful hunt meant food, warmth, and survival for the entire group. A failed hunt meant hunger, cold, and possibly death. And yet, time after time, the Neanderthals proved themselves masters of their world. They lived in small, tightly knit bands, usually no more than 20 to 30 individuals. These groups were bound together by family ties, cooperation, and the shared struggle of survival. Within the group, roles may have been divided. Some focused on hunting, others on preparing hides, maintaining tools, or caring for children and elders. The bonds between them were likely strong, for in such a harsh world, isolation meant certain death. Fossil evidence even shows Neanderthals who survived severe injuries or illnesses, shattered bones that had healed, signs of chronic disease endured over decades. This means that their companions must have cared for them, feeding and protecting those who could not contribute, demonstrating empathy and compassion. Fire, too, was their ally. In the flickering light of hearths deep inside caves, Neanderthals cooked their food, kept predators at bay, and found warmth in the frozen nights. Some evidence suggests they controlled fire with remarkable skill, maintaining hearths for months or even years in the same place. Around these fires, stories may have been told, bonds deepened, and cultures passed from one generation to the next. Though we can never know the exact words they spoke or the tales they shared, the human capacity for language and storytelling is ancient, and it is likely the Neanderthals possessed it too. Their rise was not limited to Europe alone. Over time, Neanderthals spread eastward into Western Asia, reaching as far as the Middle East and Central Asia. They adapted to a wide variety of environments, from snowy tundras to more temperate forests, from coastal plains to rugged mountain valleys. Everywhere they went, they left behind traces of their resilience. They were not confined to a single niche, but were true masters of adaptation, capable of surviving wherever the Ice Age world allowed. For nearly 300,000 years, the Neanderthals thrived. Generations rose and fell, each one carving a life from the cold stone and frozen ground. They endured climate shifts, survived against powerful predators, and learned to use the land to their advantage. In many ways, their dominance of Ice Age Europe makes them one of the most successful human species that ever lived. And yet, their story is not one of endless triumph, because even as they rose to prominence, the seeds of conflict and decline were already being sown. The world was never stable for long. Glacial cycles advanced and retreated, reshaping the land, altering the distribution of animals, and forcing human groups to migrate or perish. Competition for resources grew fierce, not only among Neanderthal tribes but with other human species. At times, they may have encountered Homo sapiens, early modern humans who had begun to emerge in Africa and were slowly spreading into Eurasia. These encounters would change the course of prehistory forever. But in their early centuries, the Neanderthals held their ground. They were the rulers of the Ice Age North, unmatched in their ability to survive and thrive in the frozen wilderness. The rise of the Neanderthals is not just the tale of a species adapting to its environment. It is also the story of how fragile, powerful, and creative humanity can be when pushed to its limits. In their faces, reconstructed from fossils and DNA, we see a reflection of ourselves, beings capable of love, fear, struggle, and triumph. They remind us that the human story is not a straight line, but a branching tree, filled with experiments, extinctions, and legacies that still live within us today. For within the cells of every person alive, fragments of Neanderthal DNA remain. they are not entirely gone, not completely lost to the snows of prehistory. The Neanderthals rose, they thrived, and though their species would one day vanish, they left a lasting imprint on the very fabric of humanity. Their story began with adaptation and survival, and it set the stage for one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of our kind. The wars, the struggles, and the final downfall that would nearly erase them from existence. The Ice Age was not a single frozen moment in time, but a long, shifting drama of climates and landscapes. Glaciers advanced and retreated over tens of thousands of years, sculpting valleys, crushing forests, and leaving behind barren plains of ice and stone. For the Neanderthals, this was the world they called home, a land of extremes where survival meant constant adaptation, where every day was defined by the balance between warmth and cold, hunger and satiety, safety and danger. Imagine waking in a cave at dawn, the embers of last night's fire still faintly glowing. The air is bitterly cold, your breath turning into clouds of frost with every exhale. Outside, the wind howls across a white, endless plain. Snow covers the ground, broken only by the distant shapes of mammoth herds moving like dark shadows against the horizon. This was daily life during much of the Pleistocene epoch, vast open spaces where resources were scarce and the struggle for survival never ended. For the Neanderthals, family and group were everything. A typical band might consist of 20 to 30 individuals, all bound together by necessity. There were no cities, no villages, no permanent settlements. Instead, they moved seasonally, following herds of animals or shifting to different shelters as the environment changed. Caves were prized. Natural protection from predators, warmth in the winter, shade in the summer. Archaeological evidence shows that some caves were occupied for generations, layered with hearths, stone tools, and bones, each layer a chapter in their history. Food dictated everything. Neanderthals were apex hunters, capable of bringing down some of the largest animals of their time. They hunted mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, giant deer, and reindeer. Their weapons, wooden spears hardened in fire, stone-tipped javelins, hand axes, were crude compared to modern technology, but in skilled hands, they were deadly. Hunting was not a solitary act, but a coordinated effort. Bands of Neanderthals worked together to surround, ambush, or drive prey into traps. Some evidence suggests they used the landscape itself, chasing animals into ravines or against steep cliffs where escape was impossible. The risk was immense. A single mistake could mean severe injury or death. Fossilized Neanderthal bones bear the scars of this dangerous lifestyle. Crushed ribs, broken skulls, fractured limbs. Their injuries resemble those of modern rodeo riders, suggesting frequent close encounters with massive, thrashing animals. Yet they endured. Time and again, they threw themselves into the hunt, because the rewards were great. A successful kill meant meat, fat, and marrow for energy, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for bindings. Every part of the animal was used, nothing went to waste. But hunting alone did not sustain them. Neanderthals were also gatherers, foraging for plants, nuts, berries, roots, and tubers when available. Seasonal abundance offered opportunities to supplement their meat-heavy diet with vital vitamins and minerals. They understood their landscapes intimately, knowing when plants would bloom, where streams would freeze, and where animals would migrate. This deep knowledge of nature was as critical as muscle and weaponry. Without it, survival would have been impossible. Daily life was physically demanding. Even the simplest tasks, breaking wood for fires, hauling water, scraping hides, required immense strength. Clothing was fashioned from animal skins, stitched together with sinew and bone needles. Footwear, though less sophisticated than modern shoes, helped protect against frostbite and jagged rocks. Fire was the heart of their existence. Archaeological sites reveal circles of stone marking ancient hearths, sometimes maintained in the same spot for years. Around these fires, Neanderthals cooked meat, warmed themselves, and likely told stories that gave meaning to their hardships. Shelter extended beyond caves. In places where caves were scarce, they built huts from wood, bones, and hides. Some sites reveal circular arrangements of mammoth bones that may have supported domed structures covered with skins, crude but effective against the biting wind. These shelters demonstrate resourcefulness, a willingness to bend the environment to their needs. Their communities were not only about survival, but also about care. Fossil evidence shows Neanderthals who lived for years despite crippling injuries or illnesses. This means their companions tended to them, fed them, protected them. Compassion was part of their existence. In one cave in Shanidar, Iraq, archaeologists found a Neanderthal skeleton with multiple severe injuries, including a withered arm and blindness in one eye. Yet he lived for decades, proof that his group cared for him long after he ceased to be useful in the hunt. This bond of empathy gave them resilience against the harshest odds. Life in the Ice Age was also shaped by predators. The world was shared with saber-toothed cats, cave lions, cave hyenas, and cave bears. These animals were as much competitors as threats. They hunted the same prey, sought the same shelters. Some caves show evidence of alternating occupation: bears in winter, humans in summer. At times, these confrontations turned violent, with Neanderthals forced to drive predators out or abandon their shelters entirely. Every decision was a negotiation with danger, yet there were moments of beauty too. The Ice Age landscape, though harsh, was stunning. Wide-open steppes covered in grasses and wildflowers during brief summers, shimmering lakes formed from glacial melt, mountains capped with snow, and skies unpolluted by modern lights. At night, the stars burned brightly and the aurora danced across the frozen heavens. In such moments, perhaps around a fire, the Neanderthals experienced wonder, awe, and reflection, emotions deeply human, binding them to us across the millennia. Their children grew up in this demanding world, learning through imitation and practice. A young Neanderthal boy might be given a small spear to practice with, learning to strike at targets of wood or bone. Girls and boys alike would learn to scrape hides, carry wood, and forage. Childhood was brief, for survival required early maturity. But laughter, play, and affection surely filled their days as well. Archaeological evidence of footprints preserved in mud and volcanic ash shows children running and playing, leaving their marks beside those of adults. Despite the dangers, Neanderthals developed culture. They used pigments, possibly for body decoration or symbolic expression. Some crafted ornaments from shells or animal teeth. Others buried their dead, covering bodies with earth or stones, perhaps accompanied by tools or flowers. These acts suggest more than practicality. They hint at rituals, at beliefs, at a recognition of something beyond survival. The Ice Age shaped every aspect of their existence. It made them strong, resourceful, and deeply connected to the land. It forged their communities in fire and ice, bound them together in compassion and struggle. But it also trapped them in a cycle of vulnerability. Every glacial shift brought new challenges, changing animal migrations, altered plant growth, floods, droughts, and storms. The very environment that had shaped them so perfectly would one day turn against them. For now, though, the Neanderthals thrived. Their lives were hard, but they endured. Each day was a negotiation with nature, each season a battle against scarcity. And though we might imagine their lives as endless hardship, they also knew kinship, love, and meaning. The Ice Age did not destroy them outright, it made them who they were. And in that frozen crucible, they became one of the most resilient species the world had ever seen. But resilience is not invincibility. As the millennia passed, the Neanderthals' world grew more crowded. New rivals emerged, new pressures mounted, and soon the simple struggles of Ice Age life would give way to something even more dangerous: conflict with other humans, a struggle not against the cold or the beasts of the land, but against their own kin. The first sparks of prehistoric war were about to be lit. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals ruled the Ice Age landscapes of Europe and Western Asia. They were the masters of the hunt, the survivors of the cold, the dominant human presence north of the Mediterranean. But the world was never empty. Beyond their territories, other branches of the human family tree were taking shape, evolving, and preparing to expand. These rivals would one day collide with the Neanderthals, reshaping prehistory in ways that echo down to us today. The first of these rivals were the Denisovans. They were a mysterious people, known today almost entirely through fragments of DNA and a few bones discovered in a remote Siberian cave. Their faces remain unknown, but their genetic legacy tells us they were close cousins of the Neanderthals, branching off from a common ancestor hundreds of thousands of years ago. While the Neanderthals spread westward into Europe, the Denisovans moved east into Asia, adapting to high mountains and cold plateaus. In places like the Himalayas, Denisovan genes still live on, allowing modern humans who inherited them to thrive at high altitudes where oxygen is thin. For a time, Neanderthals and Denisovans may not have seen each other often. Their territories overlapped in some regions of Central Asia, and there is evidence that they interbred. These encounters were likely rare but significant. Moments when two different kinds of humans met in the frozen valleys of Eurasia, exchanging not just genes, but perhaps tools, ideas, and stories around the fire. To the Neanderthals, the Denisovans were not abstract cousins. They were tangible, living rivals who could be allies one season and competitors the next. But the most formidable rival was still to come. Homo sapiens. Our own species emerged in Africa more than 200,000 years ago. For thousands of generations, early Homo sapiens lived on the African continent, honing their survival skills in savannas, forests, and deserts. They were slender, built for endurance running and long-distance travel. They wielded advanced stone tools, crafted from blades and points sharper and more versatile than the Neanderthal Mousterian tradition. Most importantly, they possessed a unique ability to innovate and adapt rapidly, combining technical skill with symbolic imagination. At first, the Neanderthals likely had no knowledge of these distant relatives. Africa was far away, separated by deserts and seas. But around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, waves of Homo sapiens began leaving Africa, spreading into the Middle East, Asia, and eventually Europe. This expansion would bring them face to face with the Neanderthals, setting the stage for one of the most significant encounters in human history. The Levant, the region stretching from modern Israel to Syria, was one of the first contact zones. Here, in caves like Skul and Kafza, archaeologists have found remains of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, sometimes separated by only a few thousand years. It suggests that the two species alternated in occupying these same shelters, perhaps driven by climate shifts, perhaps by competition. Imagine one group leaving behind hearths and tools in a cave, only for another to arrive later, examining the traces of strangers and adding their own marks to the same stone walls. These meetings were not just about territory, they were about survival. The Ice Age world could not support endless populations. Each new group meant new mouths to feed, new hunters chasing the same herds of deer, bison, or gazelle. For the Neanderthals, the arrival of Homo sapiens was a profound challenge. Their rivals brought fresh techniques, lighter frames, and perhaps more complex languages and social networks. Where Neanderthals were deeply adapted to the cold north, sapiens carried a flexibility that allowed them to thrive in a wide range of environments. It is tempting to imagine constant warfare, but the reality was likely more complicated. There were conflicts, yes, skirmishes over hunting grounds, violent clashes over water or shelter, but there were also exchanges. Genetic evidence shows that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred multiple times across tens of thousands of years. Every modern person outside Africa carries between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. Proof that these encounters were not always hostile. Love, or at least union, crossed the boundary between species. Children were born of these meetings, carrying within them the mixed heritage of two human worlds. Still, coexistence was fragile. In some places, Neanderthals seem to have been pushed aside as sapiens advanced. Their numbers dwindled, their strongholds shrinking into isolated refuges. Climate change amplified the pressure. As ice sheets expanded and retreated, habitats shifted. Herds migrated, forests disappeared, rivers changed course. In such a volatile world, even small advantages mattered. The broader social networks of Homo sapiens, the ability to trade, to share ideas across distant groups, to create symbols and art that bound people together, may have given them the edge. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Neanderthals continued to hold on. For tens of thousands of years after sapiens spread out of Africa, they remained the dominant humans in the north. They hunted mammoths in the snowy steppes, sheltered in caves, and endured the bitter winters. But their rivals were drawing closer. Archaeological layers show sapiens reaching Europe around 45,000 years ago. Within just a few thousand years, the Neanderthals who had ruled the continent for hundreds of millennia would vanish. The reasons for this disappearance are debated. Some scientists argue that Homo sapiens outcompeted them through superior technology, organization, or sheer numbers. Others suggest climate instability dealt the fatal blow, shrinking the resources available to Neanderthal populations already small and scattered. Disease may have played a role, as contact with new groups introduced pathogens they could not resist. Violence, too, cannot be ruled out. In a world of scarce resources, tribes would have fought, and in those fights, sapiens may have gradually overwhelmed their stockier cousins. What is certain is that these rivalries were deeply human. They were not just contests of survival, but of culture, identity, and belonging. To the Neanderthals, the arrival of other humans must have been unsettling. They were no longer alone in their world. Their caves, once filled only with familiar voices, now carried the echoes of strangers. Their hunting grounds, once theirs alone, now bore the footprints of rivals. In such a world, trust and fear must have mixed uneasily, sometimes producing alliances, sometimes erupting into violence. The Neanderthals were not the only ones who vanished. The Denisovans too disappeared, leaving behind only traces in our DNA. Other archaic humans, like Homo floresiensis, the hobbits of Indonesia, or Homo naledi in South Africa, flickered briefly before fading into extinction. The human family tree was full of branches, but most withered and died. Only one branch endured and spread across the globe, Homo sapiens. Yet extinction did not erase the others completely. In our blood, in our bones, in the very cells of our bodies, their legacy endures. The Neanderthals and Denisovans live on in our genes, influencing everything from our immune systems to the shape of our skulls. They are not merely rivals lost to history. They are ancestors absorbed into the fabric of who we are. But in the moment, tens of thousands of years ago, on windswept plains and in icy caves, the Neanderthals did not know they were losing a war for survival. They did not know their numbers were dwindling, that the future belonged to their rivals. They fought, they endured, they loved, they raised children, they hunted, they laughed, they told stories. They lived as fully human as any of us. And all the while, the shadow of their rivals grew longer, until the day came when the balance tipped, and the Neanderthals' dominion began to crumble. This rivalry, this meeting of human species, was one of the most profound moments in the history of our kind. It was not just the clash of populations, but the forging of the modern human identity. For out of this encounter came the world we know today, a world where only one species remains, but where the echoes of many still whisper in our veins. And as these rivals drew closer, as conflicts flared and bonds were made, the stage was set for something larger than mere survival. The scattered skirmishes of early encounters would grow into brutal contests for territory, for resources, for dominance. Soon, what began as rivalry would escalate into something much darker, a prehistoric war that would wipe out almost all Neanderthals, leaving only fragments of their story buried in caves, bones, and bloodlines. The meeting of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens did not unfold like a sudden collision, but like a gathering storm. For thousands of years, the two species coexisted in overlapping regions, watching each other from the edges of the forest, from across valleys, from the mouth of caves. At first, contact may have been rare, occasional, even curious. But in a world where food was scarce and survival depended on control of territory, it was only a matter of time before those encounters turned violent. The first clashes between Neanderthals and sapiens were not full-scale wars, but skirmishes, raids, and desperate fights over land, water, and herds. Imagine two hunting parties moving across the same landscape. A group of Neanderthals, broad and powerful, tracking a herd of reindeer through the snow. They have been following the animals for days, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, from the other side of the valley, they see movement, a band of Homo sapiens, leaner, quicker, armed with long, sharp-tipped spears and perhaps even bows. The prey is the same. The prize is survival itself. There is no negotiation here. If one group wins, the other goes hungry. If one takes the cave by the river, the other is forced into the cold. Conflict was not a choice, it was inevitable. The archaeological record hints at these encounters. In some sites, layers of occupation show Neanderthals and sapiens using the same caves within short spans of time. One group departs, another arrives, only to leave again, perhaps driven out by confrontation. Broken bones, fractured skulls, and signs of blunt force trauma on both Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens remains suggest violent struggles. These are not the marks of hunting accidents alone. They are the wounds of combat, of humans fighting humans for the right to exist. At first, the Neanderthals may have held the advantage. Their bodies were built for close combat, short, muscular frames capable of explosive bursts of strength. With heavy wooden spears and stone-tipped weapons, they could drive into enemies with terrifying force. In single combat or small skirmishes, their raw power was unmatched. A blow from a Neanderthal's club could shatter bone. Their intimate knowledge of the land, the caves, the rivers, the migration routes of animals, gave them home field advantage. In those early clashes, Homo sapiens likely learned quickly that these were not opponents to be underestimated. But sapiens had their own strengths. They were not as strong, but they were fast and enduring. Their lighter frames allowed them to travel farther and for longer, shadowing prey over vast distances until exhaustion brought the animal down. That same endurance allowed them to harass their rivals, retreat, regroup, and return again. They also carried with them technologies that changed the balance of power, finely crafted blades, lighter projectiles, and eventually the bow and arrow. These gave them reach, the ability to strike from a distance while Neanderthals closed in for melee combat. In the first clashes, brute strength met agility, and the outcomes were uncertain. Conflict did not always mean slaughter. Some encounters ended with one group retreating, unwilling to risk further losses. Others may have been tense standoffs, shouting across valleys, displays of weapons, intimidation without bloodshed. Humans have always known that violence carries risk, and survival sometimes meant knowing when to walk away. But when violence did erupt, it left scars that echoed for generations. Each group learned the capabilities of the other, and with each clash, strategies evolved. The Neanderthals may have responded with ambush tactics, using their strength in dense forests or rocky passes to launch sudden, overwhelming attacks. Sapiens, in turn, relied on speed and coordination, spreading out across terrain, using communication and signals to flank their stockier foes. These were not organized wars in the modern sense. No armies, no generals, no fortresses. But they were the seeds of something similar. organized group violence, fought with intention to secure resources and eliminate rivals. And yet not every meeting ended in blood. The same caves that show alternating occupations also hint at times of exchange. DNA evidence proves that interbreeding occurred, meaning that some encounters ended with union rather than battle. Perhaps two small bands, instead of fighting, joined forces for a time, sharing knowledge and partners, merging bloodlines. Perhaps nights around fires were filled with wary observation that slowly softened into cautious cooperation. But the fragility of such truces meant they could be broken as quickly as they were made. The pressure of the environment magnified every encounter. During colder glacial periods, when ice sheets expanded and herds migrated south, food became scarce. In those times, competition grew fierce and clashes more frequent. A single herd of reindeer could mean the difference between survival and starvation. A single cave with steady warmth and shelter could be worth risking lives for. In such conditions, peace was a luxury few could afford. The legacy of these first clashes is written not only in bones, but in behavior. Some scientists argue that the violence between species accelerated the development of cooperation within groups. To face rivals, both Neanderthals and sapiens may have tightened their social bonds, relying more heavily on trust, loyalty, and shared identity. In this way, conflict was not only destructive, but creative, forging stronger communities in the fires of adversity. But there were costs. Populations were small to begin with, and every loss mattered. For Neanderthals, already scattered in relatively small numbers across Europe, each skirmish that ended badly reduced their chances of long-term survival. Homo sapiens, with their wider networks stretching back into Africa and Asia, could replenish losses more effectively. Over time, this imbalance would begin to show. The first clashes were not decisive victories or defeats, but they planted the seeds of a shift in power, one that would grow with each passing generation. We can imagine the stories told around fires after these encounters. A Neanderthal elder warning children of the strange, fast-moving humans with their slender frames and piercing weapons. A sapiens hunter describing the terrifying strength of a rival who seemed more beast than man. These stories, passed down through generations, would shape identities: us versus them, kin versus stranger, survival versus extinction. In the moment, neither side could have known the long arc of history. To them, these were immediate struggles for food, for shelter, for life. But with hindsight, we can see that these first clashes marked the beginning of the end for the Neanderthals. Slowly, subtly, the balance tilted toward sapiens. Not because they were smarter in every way, or stronger, or destined to rule, but because in the relentless contest of survival, small advantages multiplied over time. The first clashes were just sparks. But sparks, when fanned by hunger, fear, and desperation, can ignite fires that burn across continents. What began as isolated skirmishes would eventually swell into broader conflicts. True wars of prehistory, fought not with empires and banners, but with stone and bone, with blood and fire, with the raw will to survive. And in those wars, the fate of the Neanderthals would be decided. For tens of thousands of years, the Neanderthals had ruled Europe. They were the children of the ice, perfectly adapted to survive the freezing winters, the shifting seasons, and the endless struggle for food. But the arrival of Homo sapiens changed everything. At first, encounters were rare, clashes scattered. Yet as sapiens spread farther and their numbers grew, the pressure mounted. What began as skirmishes turned into something darker, something larger. Slowly, steadily, the Ice Age landscape became the battlefield of one of the first great human wars. A prehistoric conflict so ancient and brutal that history itself nearly forgot it. This war was unlike any fought in later centuries. There were no armies, no nations, no written records. There were only tribes, small bands of hunter-gatherers scattered across valleys, forests, and plains. But make no mistake, the stakes were absolute. It was survival or extinction. Each side brought its own strengths, its own weapons, its own ways of fighting. And in the balance hung the fate of two human species. The Neanderthals were the defenders. For hundreds of millennia, their people had claimed the caves and hunting grounds of Europe. Every river, every mountain pass, every migration route was known to them. Their weapons were simple but deadly: heavy spears, stone-tipped clubs, and ambush tactics that turned the dense forests and narrow ravines into traps. In close combat, their power was terrifying. Their bodies, forged by the cold and by centuries of dangerous hunts, were built for explosive violence. The sapiens, by contrast, were the invaders, swift, cunning, relentless. They brought new technologies: lighter spears, sharper blades, and eventually the bow and arrow, which allowed them to strike from a distance. They carried fire-hardened projectiles that could pierce from afar, avoiding the crushing embrace of Neanderthal strength. But their greatest weapon was not stone or wood. It was organization. Sapiens formed larger networks, exchanging tools, food, and knowledge across vast distances. They carried ideas as well as weapons, strategies as well as stories. In a war of endurance, these advantages would prove decisive. The first true battles likely began in the fertile valleys of southern Europe, where glaciers receded to reveal rich hunting grounds. Here, herds of reindeer and bison moved seasonally, and both Neanderthals and sapiens relied on them to survive. When two groups converged on the same herd, the outcome could not be shared. The Neanderthals struck first, using ambushes to drive animals into ravines or toward spear lines. But sapiens countered by shadowing the herds over long distances, exhausting the prey, and intercepting them before Neanderthal spears could land. Tensions escalated. Tribes raided each other's camps, burned shelters, and stole food. What once had been competition turned into cycles of revenge. The war spread. In mountain passes, Neanderthals held the advantage, using the terrain to trap and overwhelm smaller bands of sapiens. Yet in open plains, sapiens triumphed, their agility and ranged weapons forcing Neanderthals into retreat. These shifting fortunes created decades of back-and-forth struggle. Neither side dominated fully at first, but while Neanderthals fought to defend what they had always known, sapiens fought to expand, driven by hunger, curiosity, and perhaps by a restless desire to claim more than survival alone. The psychological toll must have been immense. For Neanderthals, the arrival of these strange, fast-moving humans would have felt like an invasion of ghosts, enemies who could strike from afar, vanish into the night, and return again. For sapiens, the Neanderthals were terrifying adversaries, stronger and more resilient than anything they had faced. Every battle carried the weight of fear, of awe, of rage. And around fires at night, stories grew. Stories of monstrous rivals, of heroic warriors, of victories that came at unbearable cost. Archaeological traces bear silent witness to this forgotten war. In some sites, layers of tools shift abruptly, Mousterian implements of Neanderthals giving way to blade technologies of sapiens, as if one culture replaced another almost overnight. In others, bones show trauma, skull fractures, embedded spear points, shattered ribs, signs of violence between humans. There are caves that tell the story of sudden abandonment, as if one group had been driven out and another quickly took their place. But perhaps the most haunting evidence lies not in artifacts, but in DNA. For while this was a war, it was not only about death, it was also about union. Time and again, Neanderthals and sapiens came together, producing children whose mixed heritage survives in our blood today. Even in the midst of conflict, there were moments of connection, of intimacy, of fragile peace. These encounters blur the line between friend and foe, ally and enemy. They remind us that this war was not fought in absolutes. It was messy, human, and full of contradictions. Over centuries, the balance began to shift. Neanderthal populations, already small and fragmented, could not recover from repeated losses. Each battle, each raid, each famine chipped away at their numbers. Sapiens, by contrast, had broader networks stretching beyond Europe. Even if a tribe was lost, others could move in, replenishing the frontier. Slowly, the Neanderthals were pushed back, first from open plains, then from fertile valleys, until they clung to the cold refuges of mountains and caves. The war was not fought in a single campaign, but in waves over thousands of years. There was no single decisive battle, but rather a grinding attrition that eroded Neanderthal strength. For the Neanderthals, every winter grew harder, every hunt riskier, every clash more costly. The war did not end with a treaty or a truce. It ended with silence, as one species dwindled while another rose to dominance. And yet, to call it simply the extinction of the Neanderthals misses the deeper truth. This forgotten war shaped who we are. It forced Homo sapiens to adapt, to sharpen their strategies, to strengthen their bonds. It forged resilience in both species, though only one survived. The genes of Neanderthals live on within us, proof that this war was not a simple annihilation, but a merging of destinies. The battlefield was not only the snowy plains of Europe, it was also our DNA, where the legacy of Neanderthals remains woven into our cells. This war is forgotten, not because it was unimportant, but because it left no chronicles, no names, no monuments. The Neanderthals did not write of their last stands. Sapiens did not record their victories. But the echoes are there, in bones buried in caves, in tools scattered across ancient hearths, in the bloodlines of every person alive today. To listen closely to the silence of prehistory is to hear the cries of battle, the clash of stone and wood, the desperate struggle of two kinds of humans fighting for the same earth. The forgotten prehistoric war was not merely a clash of survival, it was the crucible in which the modern human world was born. From it came not only the extinction of the Neanderthals, but the dominance of Homo sapiens, the rise of culture, the spread of language, and the seeds of civilization. It was a war that shaped everything that came after. And though the Neanderthals lost, their memory endures, in our bones, in our stories, in the shadow of a war that shaped humanity itself. In the frozen battlegrounds of Ice Age Europe, survival was not just about strength or endurance. It was about the tools a tribe carried in its hands, the weapons forged from stone, wood, and bone that could mean the difference between a full belly and starvation, between victory and death. The prehistoric war between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was fought not with bronze or iron, not with armies or fortresses, but with the simplest of technologies, tools honed through generations of trial and error. And yet, in their simplicity lay innovation, strategy, and the seeds of the future. For the Neanderthals, weapons were an extension of their bodies. Their massive strength shaped their style of combat. The heavy thrusting spear was their weapon of choice. A stout wooden shaft, sometimes tipped with carefully knapped flint, designed to be held and driven into prey or enemy at close range. Archaeological finds suggest that Neanderthals were masters of thrusting, not throwing. They moved in close, face to face with their targets, relying on raw power to deliver killing blows. Imagine the terrifying force of a stocky Neanderthal warrior, muscles hardened by decades of hunting, charging forward and plunging a spear into the chest of a bison or a rival human. Their stone tools, known as the Mousterian tradition, were remarkable in their precision. Neanderthal knappers struck flakes from cores of flint with deliberate skill, creating sharp scrapers, knives, and spear points. These tools were not only functional, but adaptable, reshaped as they wore down, used for butchering animals, carving wood, or preparing hides. In war, they became daggers, hand axes, and cutting blades. A Neanderthal's toolkit was compact but versatile, carried at all times, ready for both the hunt and the fight. Yet their reliance on close combat carried risks. To face prey or enemy at arm's length meant injury was inevitable. Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of broken bones, healed fractures, and crushing trauma, injuries consistent with violent impacts. They fought up close because their bodies allowed it, but each clash demanded a heavy toll. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, approached weapons differently. Where Neanderthals relied on strength, sapiens relied on distance. They perfected the art of projectile hunting, crafting lighter spears designed to be thrown with force and accuracy. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pinnacle Point in Africa shows early sapiens using spear throwers or atlatls, wooden devices that extended the arm and gave added leverage, allowing projectiles to fly farther and strike harder. Later, they would develop the bow and arrow, a revolution in ranged combat. With these weapons, sapiens did not need to meet their enemies head-on. They could wound from afar, harass, retreat, and strike again. Their stone tools, part of the so-called Upper Paleolithic tradition, were finer, sharper, and more varied than those of the Neanderthals. Long blades struck from carefully prepared cores produced points that could be hafted onto wooden shafts, creating lightweight but deadly weapons. They also crafted bone and antler tools, flexible and durable, giving them a technological edge. Where Neanderthal tools were robust and pragmatic, sapiens' tools were innovative, specialized, and designed for adaptability. This difference in weapons reflected a deeper difference in strategy. Neanderthals, built for explosive bursts of strength, thrived in ambushes and close-quarter combat. They could overwhelm prey or rivals with raw force. Sapiens, with their lighter bodies and broader social networks, fought wars of endurance. They did not need to defeat their enemies in a single clash. They could strike from a distance, retreat, regroup, and wear them down. It was a contest between the hammer and the swarm, between strength and strategy. Fire, too, was a weapon. Both Neanderthals and sapiens mastered its use, but sapiens seem to have wielded it more aggressively. They may have used fire to drive animals, or rivals, from caves, to burn shelters, or to clear forests for easier hunting. Flames were not just warmth and light, they were power, a force that could reshape landscapes and frighten enemies. The sight of a burning camp, the smell of smoke drifting across a valley would have been as much a weapon of fear as of destruction. Weapons were more than tools of death. They were symbols of identity. A finely crafted spear point carried pride, a sign of skill and belonging to a group. The process of making tools was itself a ritual, knowledge passed from elders to children, shaping not just survival but culture. Around fires, knappers taught the rhythm of striking flint, the angles of pressure, the feel of stone in hand. These lessons were as important as hunting itself. In this way, weapons were not only instruments of war, but threads binding communities together. The war between Neanderthals and sapiens was, at its core, a technological contest. In the short term, Neanderthal weapons were brutally effective. In close combat, their spears and clubs could crush and kill with terrifying speed. But over the long term, the ranged weapons of sapiens shifted the balance. To kill from a distance meant fewer injuries, fewer deaths, greater survival. Every battle fought with thrown spears instead of thrusting blows tilted the odds toward sapiens. Consider the battlefield of a frozen valley. A Neanderthal band lies in wait, heavy spears ready, their bodies hidden among rocks. A herd of reindeer passes, and with them, a group of sapiens hunters. The ambush begins. Neanderthals charge, driving their spears into the snow. But before they close the distance, the sapiens launch their own attack. Spears arc through the air, striking with deadly accuracy. One Neanderthal falls, another staggers, wounded. The rest hesitate. The balance of terror has shifted. Where once the Neanderthals' brute strength was unstoppable, now it is blunted by the reach of ranged weapons. This was not an overnight change. For thousands of years, both species coexisted, fought, and adapted. But technology has a way of multiplying advantages. Each new innovation in projectile weaponry widened the gap. Each sharpened blade, each lighter spear, each refined tool meant fewer risks, more kills, and more survivors. Over time, the relentless pressure of these small advantages eroded the Neanderthals' dominance. And yet, it is too simple to say that technology alone decided the war. Neanderthals were not incapable of innovation. They, too, experimented with adhesives to fix stone points, to wooden shafts with pigments for symbolic use, with tools that served multiple purposes. But their smaller, more isolated populations may have limited the spread of these ideas. In contrast, sapiens carried not just weapons, but culture across vast distances, sharing new methods rapidly between groups. A breakthrough in one valley could spread across continents in a matter of generations. Weapons of survival were ultimately weapons of destiny. They determined who hunted successfully, who defended territory, who lived and who died. They were not glamorous, not polished like the swords of later civilizations, but they were no less decisive. The clash of heavy Neanderthal spears against the lighter projectiles of sapiens was the sound of history turning, of one branch of humanity giving way to another. And as the war dragged on, these weapons did more than kill. They reshaped minds. They taught sapiens that ingenuity could overcome strength, that strategy could outlast power. They taught Neanderthals the brutal lesson of vulnerability, that even the strongest could fall before an enemy who fought differently. By the end of this forgotten conflict, it was clear that weapons were not just about survival. They were about the future. The same ingenuity that created bone-tipped spears and stone blades would one day build cities, ships, and machines. The same fire that drove rivals from caves would one day power civilizations. In the weapons of the Ice Age, we see the roots of everything humanity would become. The Neanderthals fought with courage, with strength, with tools that had carried them through millennia. But the weapons of survival favored those who could innovate, adapt, and share. And in that contest, Homo sapiens proved unstoppable. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals had endured everything the Ice Age threw at them. They had survived glacial winters, hunted colossal beasts, and defended their territories from predators and rivals. But around 45,000 years ago, the balance began to shift. What had once been a slow contest for survival tipped into a cascade of losses from which the Neanderthals would never recover. This was the turning point, the moment when strength and resilience were no longer enough, when the forces of climate, famine, disease, and relentless human rivals aligned against them. The first and most powerful enemy was the climate itself. The Ice Age was never stable. Glaciers advanced and retreated in cycles, reshaping landscapes again and again. But during the period when Homo sapiens expanded into Europe, the climate grew especially volatile. Sudden cold snaps gripped the continent, freezing rivers and driving herds south. Then abrupt warming melted glaciers, flooding valleys and altering ecosystems overnight. For Neanderthals, who relied on intimate knowledge of local landscapes, this instability was devastating. The reindeer and mammoth herds they had hunted for generations vanished from familiar routes. Forests thinned or spread unpredictably. A cave that had been a safe haven for decades might become uninhabitable within a single lifetime. Homo sapiens, by contrast, were less tied to specific places. Their broader networks and mobile strategies allowed them to adapt more quickly to shifting conditions. They could move farther, faster, and call on allies in distant regions. For the Neanderthals, each environmental shock cut deeper. Populations already small and scattered became further isolated, cut off by ice, water, or famine. In their shrinking refuges, survival became increasingly precarious. Famine sharpened the pressure. Archaeological evidence shows Neanderthal bones bearing marks of malnutrition during this period. Some sites reveal broken animal bones cracked open for marrow, a desperate attempt to squeeze the last calories from a carcass. Others show burned remains of plants and small game, resources Neanderthals once largely ignored, now exploited out of necessity. Even cannibalism has been documented. Bones of Neanderthals themselves, scraped clean of flesh, suggesting that in the harshest winters, hunger drove them to the unthinkable. Famine does more than weaken bodies. It breaks communities, undermining morale and sowing despair. Disease may also have played a role in this turning point. As sapiens expanded into Europe, they brought with them pathogens from Africa and Asia. In small, isolated populations like those of the Neanderthals, new diseases could spread rapidly, with devastating effects. While direct evidence of epidemics in the Paleolithic is scarce, the dynamics are clear. Any contact between genetically distinct populations risks transmission of microbes. For Neanderthals, with fewer immune defenses, this could have been catastrophic. The scars of combat could heal, but invisible enemies, fevers, infections, plagues, may have quietly thinned their numbers. Even within their own ranks, Neanderthals faced challenges. Small, scattered groups often numbered fewer than 30 individuals. Such isolation made genetic diversity fragile. Over generations, inbreeding could increase the risk of hereditary weaknesses. Fossil DNA from some late Neanderthal remains shows signs of low genetic variation, the genetic echo of shrinking numbers. In war and survival, numbers matter. A tribe weakened by illness or by internal scarcity could not stand long against better-fed, better-connected rivals. Then there was Homo sapiens themselves. By 45,000 years ago, sapiens were spreading rapidly through Europe, occupying caves, valleys, and coastlines. They carried with them not only superior projectile weapons, but also art, music, and symbolic culture. Cave paintings, carved figurines, and shell ornaments testify to a worldview rich in imagination and cohesion. This symbolic culture may seem unrelated to war, but it was a weapon in its own way. Shared symbols and stories bound sapiens tribes together, creating alliances across vast distances. When they met Neanderthals, they did not come as isolated groups, but as members of larger cultural networks. Neanderthals, too, had symbolic practices, pigments, ornaments, possible burials. But the scale and intensity of sapiens' culture far outpaced theirs. With stronger networks, sapiens could muster larger groups, coordinate hunts, and sustain long-term strategies. The war that had once been fought tribe against tribe increasingly became a war of systems, and in this contest, the Neanderthals fell behind. Archaeological layers show the shift with stark clarity. In regions where Neanderthals had lived for millennia, their toolkits suddenly vanish, replaced by the blade-based technologies of sapiens. In some caves, this transition is so rapid that it suggests displacement, one group driving out another, not over centuries, but in a matter of generations. These were not peaceful takeovers. They were victories won on battlefields of snow and stone. Victories that left no chroniclers, but plenty of silent witnesses in the form of broken tools and abandoned hearths. The turning point was not marked by a single battle, but by attrition. Each lost valley, each abandoned cave, each defeated band chipped away at Neanderthal presence. Their range shrank like a receding tide, until they were confined to scattered refugees in southern Europe, Spain, Italy, the Balkans. Once rulers of a continent, they became cornered survivors, fighting not for dominance, but for mere existence. Imagine the despair of a Neanderthal band retreating into the mountains, pursued by rivals, their numbers dwindling. Fires burn low, the great herds are gone. Children cry with hunger. Elders remember times when the land was theirs, when their people filled the valleys. Now they are ghosts of a fading lineage, watching strangers occupy the caves that once held their ancestors' bones. The psychological impact of defeat is impossible to measure, but easy to imagine. Human beings are storytellers, and Neanderthals were no different. Around their fires, they must have told stories of strength, of past victories, of their place in the world. But as defeat followed defeat, what happened to those stories? Did they lose faith in their own endurance? Did fear of sapiens become legend? Tales of shadowy hunters who struck from afar, who multiplied endlessly, who could not be driven away. The turning point was as much cultural as it was material. To lose faith in survival is to hasten extinction. Yet even in decline, the Neanderthals did not vanish instantly. For thousands of years, they clung on in isolated pockets, interbreeding with sapiens, leaving fragments of themselves in our DNA. They resisted, they endured, they adapted as best they could. But the tide was against them. The combination of climate chaos, famine, disease, and relentless sapiens rivals proved overwhelming. By around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. The last strongholds in Spain and Gibraltar flickered out like dying embers, leaving Homo sapiens as the sole surviving branch of the human family. The turning point had passed, and with it, an entire species. But to say they simply lost is to misunderstand their legacy. Their fall was not just the end of a species, but the shaping of ours. The genes of Neanderthals live on in every non-African human today, influencing everything from immunity to metabolism. The lessons of their resilience, their adaptation, their ingenuity remain part of the human story. The turning point that doomed them also defined us, ensuring that the legacy of the Neanderthals would never fully vanish. In the cold winds of prehistoric Europe, the Neanderthals stood at the edge of history, and in the clash with their rivals, they reached their limit. That moment, the turning point, was both their downfall and our inheritance. From it, the world we know began to take shape. The end of the Neanderthals did not come with a single, dramatic moment. There was no final battlefield, no last stand where one tribe was wiped out in a blaze of glory. Instead, their collapse was slow, uneven, and haunting. Over thousands of years, their world shrank piece by piece, valley by valley, until only scattered groups remained. And then, like the fading glow of embers in a hearth, they were gone. By 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals' once vast range across Europe and Western Asia had dwindled to a handful of refugees. Southern Spain, the Balkans, parts of Italy, and small corners of Western Asia were the last places they clung to survival. Where once they had dominated icy plains and forests stretching from Britain to Siberia, they now existed only in scattered pockets, cut off from one another by glaciers, rivers, and advancing Homo sapiens. Isolation became their prison. In these refugees, life grew harder. Populations were tiny, often no more than a few dozen individuals. Archaeological evidence suggests that genetic diversity plummeted during this time. DNA recovered from some of the last Neanderthals reveals signs of inbreeding, an unavoidable consequence of small communities marrying within their own circles. With each generation, vulnerabilities increased. Hereditary weaknesses, reduced immunity, lower fertility. A species that had endured for hundreds of thousands of years was now fragile, teetering on the edge. Hunger deepened the crisis. As the climate shifted unpredictably, herds of mammoths, bison, and reindeer became scarce. Rivers that had once teemed with fish froze or dried. Forests shifted, shrinking hunting grounds. The archaeological record shows Neanderthal diets becoming more desperate. Smaller animals, more plants, marrow extracted from the bones of even the tiniest creatures. In some sites, bones of Neanderthals themselves bear cut marks, evidence of cannibalism during desperate times. This was not daily practice, but a grim response to famine. The psychological weight of collapse must have been enormous. Imagine a band of Neanderthals huddled in a cave in southern Spain. The elders remember when the valleys outside were filled with mammoth herds and the laughter of larger tribes. Now, the cave is silent. The children are few, their mothers worn by hunger. The young men go out to hunt, but return empty-handed, their faces hollow with failure. Around the fire, stories are still told. of bravery, of survival, of ancestors who fought mammoths with spears. But those stories ring hollow against the silence of absence. Conflict, too, may have hastened their decline. With resources scarce, Neanderthal groups may have fought one another as much as they fought Homo sapiens. Small-scale wars over caves, rivers, or hunting grounds could have thinned their numbers further. Each battle was costly. With so few individuals, even a handful of deaths could cripple a community. Homo sapiens, more numerous and better connected, could recover from such losses. Neanderthals could not. Meanwhile, the advance of Homo sapiens continued relentlessly. By this point, sapiens were firmly established in Europe. Their networks stretched across valleys and mountains, linking groups into a larger cultural web. They painted caves with vivid scenes of animals and hunts, carved figurines, and crafted music from bone flutes. These were not just works of art, they were expressions of identity and unity. When sapiens clashed with Neanderthals, they did so with a confidence born of belonging to something larger than a single band. The Neanderthals, scattered and isolated, could not match that unity. Interbreeding still occurred during this final phase, but less often. Genetic evidence suggests that most of the mixing between sapiens and Neanderthals happened earlier, around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago. By the time the Neanderthals were collapsing, their encounters with sapiens were more often hostile than intimate. Still, the legacy of those earlier unions ensured that Neanderthals would not vanish entirely. Their DNA lived on, even as their tribes disappeared. The archaeological silence of their disappearance is chilling. In some caves, layers of Neanderthal occupation end abruptly, replaced immediately by sapiens' tools and hearths. It is as though one group was forced out or perished, and another stepped in without pause. In others, there are signs of abandonment, as if the last Neanderthals simply walked away, leaving their fires cold and their tools scattered, never to return. What we do not see is just as telling. There are no sudden innovations, no new bursts of cultural complexity in their final centuries. While sapiens painted walls with visions of bison and horses, the Neanderthals left little behind in their last days. This does not mean they lacked creativity or spirit, but it may reflect exhaustion, despair, and the crushing weight of decline. When survival consumes every thought, there is little energy left for symbols. Some of the very last Neanderthals lived in Gibraltar, on the southern tip of Spain. Caves like Gorham's Cave hold traces of their presence dating to around 40,000 years ago. Here, they clung to life by the sea, hunting fish, gathering shellfish, and foraging along rocky coasts. But even this refuge could not save them. As sapiens spread, even these last pockets faded into silence. The Neanderthals, once rulers of the Ice Age, were gone. Why did they collapse so completely? The truth lies in the convergence of forces. Climate instability shrank their world, famine weakened their bodies, isolation eroded their genetics, rivalry and warfare drained their numbers, and sapiens, with their expanding networks and technologies, filled every gap the Neanderthals left behind. No single cause explains their extinction. It was death by 1,000 cuts, relentless pressures that allowed no recovery. And yet, to see only tragedy is to miss the larger story. The Neanderthals did not vanish into nothing. They merged, in part, with us. Every non-African human alive today carries between 1 and 2% of Neanderthal DNA. Their genes shape our immune systems, our skin, even some aspects of our metabolism. In this way, they live on within us, not as fossils or shadows, but as part of who we are. The collapse of the Neanderthals was not the end of their story, but the beginning of ours. Their disappearance cleared the way for Homo sapiens to dominate the globe, to invent agriculture, cities, and civilizations. But it also left us with a reminder that survival is never guaranteed, that even the strongest can fall, that history is fragile. Picture the final moments. A small band in a cave by the sea, the fire burning low, the wind howling outside. They do not know they are the last of their kind. To them, life is just another struggle, another day of hunger and hope. But in that cave, as embers turn to ash, a chapter of human history closes forever. The Neanderthals collapse into silence, leaving behind only traces, bones, tools, and whispers in our blood. Though the Neanderthals as a species collapsed around 40,000 years ago, they never vanished in a single instant. Their disappearance was not a clean break, but a slow, uneven fading. In some valleys, they were already gone, replaced by Homo sapiens. In other refugees, caves in Spain, Italy, or the Balkans, small groups still endured, clinging to survival for generations after their kin elsewhere had perished. These were the survivors, the last echoes of a people who had once ruled Ice Age Europe. To imagine them is to imagine resilience against impossible odds. In Gibraltar, at Gorham's Cave, traces of Neanderthal life have been found dating to some of the latest periods of their existence. Here, they turned to the sea when the great herds of reindeer and mammoths disappeared. They gathered shellfish, hunted seals, and foraged along rocky shores. In Italy, evidence suggests some groups survived by focusing on smaller game and plants, adapting in desperate ways to landscapes once rich with big prey. These last Neanderthals were not the proud hunters of mammoths their ancestors had been. They were remnants, making do, adjusting to scarcity. Yet survival is never just about food or shelter. It is also about connection. And in their final centuries, the Neanderthals were not alone. They lived side by side with Homo sapiens, sometimes fighting, sometimes avoiding, but sometimes mingling in ways that would shape the future of humanity. Genetic evidence tells us that interbreeding occurred multiple times across thousands of years. Modern humans outside of Africa today carry between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA. This is not trivial. In fact, it means that every person alive in Europe, Asia, or the Americas today is in part a descendant of the Neanderthals. Their bloodlines did not vanish, they merged with ours. What does this DNA mean? It influences us in subtle but real ways. Some Neanderthal genes helped boost immune systems, offering resistance to infections. Others affected skin and hair, helping Homo sapiens adapt to colder, darker climates. Certain genetic fragments have even been linked to metabolism, influencing how the body processes fat, a trait that would have been valuable in Ice Age environments where calories were scarce and winters long. In short, the Neanderthals gave us tools for survival, carried invisibly in our cells. But not all inheritance was beneficial. Some Neanderthal DNA has been linked to autoimmune conditions, allergies, and even vulnerabilities to modern diseases. In this sense, their legacy is complex, a mixture of strengths and weaknesses, just as in life. Yet even these less favorable traits remind us of their enduring presence. To this day, when our immune system flares in response to pollen or our skin reacts to the sun, we may be feeling the whispers of Neanderthal ancestry. Beyond genes, the survivors left traces in culture. In some archaeological sites, Homo sapiens adopted techniques long used by Neanderthals, specific methods of stone knapping, hunting strategies, and the use of pigments. This suggests that the interaction between the two species was not one-sided conquest, but also exchange. Neanderthals influenced sapiens as much as sapiens overwhelmed them. Some of the very things that made sapiens successful, adaptability, innovation, resilience, may have been strengthened by what they learned from their cousins. It is easy to think of the last Neanderthals as tragic figures, clinging desperately to life as their world collapsed. But another perspective is possible. They endured long enough to ensure that a part of them would never die. Every interbreeding, every shared tool, every exchange of knowledge was a way of saying, "We will live on through you." In that sense, the survivors achieved something profound. They bridged the gap between species, ensuring their essence continued in the only way it could. Imagine then the final generations. A Neanderthal child playing on the rocky shore of Gibraltar, her footprints left beside those of her sapiens cousins. A young man in Italy, half Neanderthal and half sapiens, holding a blade crafted in a new style while still carrying the strength of his Neanderthal father. Around campfires, mixed groups may have spoken, hunted, and dreamed together, not knowing that they were weaving the future of humanity itself. Their survival story is also written in silence. After around 40,000 years ago, purely Neanderthal sites vanish from the record. But this does not mean that every Neanderthal body perished in isolation. Instead, many were absorbed into sapiens groups, their distinct identity blurred but not erased. The survivors did not win the war, but they did not lose everything. They became part of something larger. To modernize, the survival of 1 or 2% of their DNA may seem insignificant. But consider this. Over hundreds of thousands of years, countless human lineages have vanished entirely. Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, all gone, leaving no trace in our bodies. The Neanderthals alone remain within us, their survival encoded in every cell. That is no small victory. The concept of survivors extends beyond biology. They survive in memory too. When we reconstruct their faces from fossils, when we study their tools, when we tell their story, we revive them in imagination. They live in the questions we ask. What did they think? How did they feel? What songs or stories did they whisper in caves as the wind howled outside? These questions make them more than bones and genomes. They make them part of us. Perhaps the greatest irony is this. The Neanderthals did not survive as a separate people, but in blending with Homo sapiens, they became immortal. They exist in billions of humans today, scattered across the globe, carried far beyond the cold plains of Ice Age Europe. Their survivors are us. When we look at our hands, our faces, our families, we are not looking at purely modern humans. We are mosaics, patchworks of ancient lineages, carrying fragments of stories older than civilization, older than agriculture, older than writing. The Neanderthals are part of that story, written into our very being. So, in truth, they were never truly extinguished. Their fires may have gone cold, their caves may have fallen silent, but their essence endures. They survived not as tribes or nations, but as whispers in our DNA, as shadows in our bones, as influences in our immune systems, our bodies, our lives. The survivors remind us that extinction is rarely absolute. It is transformation. The Neanderthals did not simply end. They changed, merging into the river of humanity that flows to this day. And though they could not know it, in those final encounters, in those unions with sapiens, they secured a kind of immortality. The story of the Neanderthals is not only a story of extinction, it is a story of humanity, fragility, and memory. For hundreds of thousands of years, they endured where others would have failed. They hunted the most dangerous beasts, braved the coldest winters, and built lives in harsh and unforgiving landscapes. Their disappearance does not make them losers, but witnesses to a deeper truth. Even the strongest species can fall when the world changes. What they left us is not only bones and tools. It is a reflection on what it means to be human. Neanderthals buried their dead, may have painted their bodies, and crafted ornaments. They cared for the sick and the injured, even when it offered no immediate advantage. They loved. They suffered. They hoped. In their actions, we recognize fragments of ourselves. Their legacy also lives in our bodies. Every person outside Africa still carries a small portion of their DNA. Within our genes, they continue to breathe. They shape our immune defenses, our skin, our reactions to the world. We are not only the descendants of Homo sapiens, we are also, in part, the children of the Neanderthals. Every heartbeat, every breath, is proof that their lineage was never fully erased. But beyond biology, they leave us with a lesson. Their disappearance reminds us that nothing is guaranteed. Neanderthals ruled Europe for hundreds of millennia. They seemed invincible. Yet within just a few thousand years, they were replaced, absorbed, erased as a distinct people. Their fate is a warning to us. Even modern humanity is not immune to the forces of climate, catastrophe, or upheaval. What feels eternal is, in truth, fragile. At the same time, their story invites humility. For too long, they were caricatured as brutish, backward, incapable of thought or creativity. Today, we know they were close to us, perhaps closer than we ever imagined. They had emotions, cultures, memories. To ignore them is to ignore part of ourselves. To rediscover them is to embrace the truth that humanity is broader and more diverse than we once believed. The Neanderthals also give us a vision of collective memory. For thousands of years, their story was forgotten. No words, no songs survived. And yet, we bring them back to life through science, archaeology, and genetics. By studying them, we grant them a kind of immortality. They are no longer just fossils, but characters in our shared human history. So, what is the legacy of a lost people? It is the idea that we are never alone in time. We are made of all the humanities that came before us. Homo erectus, Denisovans, and above all, Neanderthals. Their fall reminds us of our fragility, but their endurance inspires us. Their DNA within us proves that no extinction is ever total as long as traces remain. In the end, Neanderthals are not a vanished people. They are a transformed people, integrated, absorbed, passed on. They live in our genes, in our stories, in our reflections about who we are. When we gaze at the stars, when we light a fire, when we tell a story by the hearth, a part of us repeats gestures they once made. Their legacy is to remind us that humanity is a collective journey. We are a mosaic of survivals and extinctions, a fabric of intertwined stories. And as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their story, Neanderthals are not truly gone. They continue to walk beside us, invisible yet present, in the breath of the wind, in the chill of winter, in the memory carried within our blood. And if you want to see another video, you can click right here.